So now we'll begin Chapter 9, which is the endocrine system. The endocrine system works in correspondence with our nervous system to regulate various body processes and overall, in order to maintain homeostasis overall. It's spread out throughout the body. There isn't a set localized area that the endocrine system is located in. Some structures within the brain include the hypothalamus, the pineal gland, and the pituitary gland. Some specific structures in the neck and anterior surface of the trachea or throat area would be the thyroid and parathyroid glands. You can see them here in this area. The parathyroid glands are actually on the back of the neck. There's also some of our endocrine organs on top of our kidneys, the adrenal glands, right here, the little hats on top of our kidneys. And within our abdominopelvic cavity, we have our pancreas, which you can kind of see here is this little fish-shaped blob, the ovaries in the female, and the testes in the male. Ovaries and testes serve a dual role, both within the reproductive system as well as the endocrine system. In this chapter, we'll look only at their endocrine function. This video here goes through the basics of hormonal regulation, secretion, as well as concentration. So let's talk about what the endocrine system does. Ultimately, it's helping to maintain day-to-day homeostasis through chemicals called hormones. As I mentioned before, it's working in conjunction with our nervous system to help maintain moment-to-moment homeostasis. Our endocrine system differs from our nervous system in the way it communicates throughout the body. The endocrine system uses hormones, those chemical messengers, whereas the nervous system is using those electrochemical signals in the form of an action potential. There are two different types of glands in our body. The endocrine glands are the glands that secrete hormones or chemical signals directly into the bloodstream. The endocrine cells can be found in various organs that have primary roles within other organ systems, like the hypothalamus, which is mostly nervous tissue, or our pancreas, which is also associated with our digestive tract. Endocrine cells can also be found within tissues, so they don't have to be within a particular organ. For example, adipose tissue or fat tissue also plays a role in the endocrine system. It has endocrine cells associated with it, and we'll look at that function later. There's also exocrine glands. Exocrine glands would be like our salivary glands, sweat glands, and oil glands. These are glands that secrete chemicals through ducts or tubes. How do hormones work? Well, their general type of action is to be released into the bloodstream from the special endocrine cell, and then those hormones will go to specific target cells throughout the body. The hormone will bind to a hormone receptor on the surface of the target cell. Hormones are released as a response to the change in the environment, and once the hormone and target cell interact, homeostasis can then be restored. Once homeostasis is restored, hormone secretion is going to stop through negative feedback. This animation here goes through the mechanism of hormone action, the idea of the hormone and receptor, as well as negative feedback, which is a review from Chapter 1. This video here goes through hormone feedback loops. I strongly encourage you to check this video out as it strongly relates to this chapter. There's two major types of hormones. There's actually three types of hormones if you want to be more specific, but our book just goes over the two major types. Steroid hormones are one type. These are the fatty hormones, so they're going to be lipid soluble. They dissolve in fats or they dissolve in lipids. They can go through the cell membrane of the target cell. Typically, these are the hormones that are made from cholesterol. They take longer to act, but then because they take longer to act, their effects are going to last longer than those non-steroid hormones. Non-steroid hormones are not lipid soluble. They're water soluble, so they will dissolve in water. They're usually made from amino acids or peptides or larger proteins. Because they're non-lipid soluble, they cannot go through the cell membrane, so these are the ones that are going to have to bind to a membrane receptor on the surface of the target cell. They act faster because they're binding to the receptors as opposed to squeezing through the cell membranes, but because they act faster, they're going to have shorter, their effects are going to be shorter lived than the steroid hormones. So Steroid hormones can go directly into the target cell, as I mentioned. They pass right through that cell membrane. The hormone can bind to its receptor inside of the cell. Maybe the receptor is on the nucleus of the cell, or maybe the receptor is on the mitochondria of the cell, or the endoplasmic reticulum, etc. When that happens, it's going to stimulate specific genes to make new proteins. For example, new enzymes or new channel proteins for the cell membrane. Those new proteins can alter the activity of the cell, make the cell bring in more calcium or release more potassium, or do a different type of catabolic reaction more effectively because of the production of a new enzyme. So this is showing you how those steroid hormones work. So you have a transport protein that's bound to various hormones, or the hormone can be a free floating hormone. Either way, it is diffusing from the bloodstream directly into our target cell, so it does not have to bind to a receptor on the cell membrane. It's going to bind to a receptor inside the cell. In this case, it's a special receptor inside the cell's nucleus. That receptor is then going to trigger a cascade of events that causes transcription and translation, which you may remember, those are the two parts of protein synthesis. The DNA can unwind and unzip and make mRNA. The mRNA can travel to the ribosome, and the ribosome can then make a new functional protein. This new protein can alter the cell's activity in some way. Maybe this new protein is going to be a new channel protein for the cell membrane, so the cell can now let sodium in. Or maybe this new protein is a new enzyme, so this cell can now break down a certain chemical that's in it. Some examples of steroid hormones are those that are secreted by the ovaries, testes, and adrenal glands. These are our sex hormones. These give male and female sexual characteristics such as facial hair or voice deepening or muscle tissue growth, breast tissue development, etc. The adrenal cortex also secretes mineralocorticoids. These are substances that act on the kidneys to help increase sodium and water absorption, reabsorption I should say, as well as potassium excretion. So all of those are going to maintain a certain level of fluid in our body, and that helps to maintain our blood pressure. Non-steroid hormones cannot pass through the cell membrane, so they're going to bind to surface receptors on the cell membrane. When they do, it's called a hormone receptor complex that's formed. That complex is then going to trigger a second messenger to be formed within the cell, and that second messenger can alter the activities of the cell. And with that second messenger, you're going to get a variety of responses. So it's not always in the case of the steroid hormones, it's not always going to increase the amount of enzyme or whatever. It may be actually inhibiting a particular enzyme. So here you see the example of how non-steroid hormones work. They're going to diffuse from the capillaries, bind to a receptor because they can't just squeeze through the cell membrane in this case because they're polar molecules. They're going to trigger a primary or first messenger called a G protein within the cell membrane. That first messenger is then going to trigger a second messenger. In this case, it's called cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP can activate proteins that can do many types of physiological activities inside the cell. So this would be another enzyme can be made in this case, or phosphorylation can occur to form ATP. Cyclic AMP, when it is present in high concentrations within the cell, is going to increase that cell's metabolism. If you remember, metabolism is just the general term for chemical reactions inside the cell. It doesn't mean that the cell can now break down fat or use energy better. It just means that the chemical reactions are happening more effectively, whatever those chemical reactions happen to be. So some examples of non-steroid hormones, cyclic AMP or cAMP, that's a special molecule that's made from ATP. There's also calcium. When that hormone receptor complex is formed, those calcium channels can be opened, allowing the calcium to enter, and that can lead to metabolic changes inside the cell as well. So, some types of non-steroid hormones include epinephrine and norepinephrine. Those you may recall when we talked about the sympathetic nervous system. Those are responsible for our fight or flight response. There's also a specific hormone secreted by the pituitary called ADH, antidiuretic hormone. This is going to signal to the kidneys to reabsorb water, in other words, maintain fluid to keep our blood pressure elevated. Sometimes our hormones are hyposecreted, meaning their secretion rate is diminishing. This could happen at the primary level, where there is some type of defect within the gland that is directly secreting the hormone. So in the case of somebody that has hypothyroidism, that would be primary hyposecretion. Their thyroid hormone is not secreting the T3 and T4 thyroid hormones like they need to be. There's also a secondary hyposecretion. This would be a defect in a gland that secretes a stimulating or releasing hormone. That would be like the pituitary. That would be a secondary hyposecretion. So the pituitary, as we'll see, is the master gland. And if the master gland isn't working properly, then all of the other glands are not going to work properly. So if that secondary hyposecretion is occurring, then the thyroid gland is not getting the signal from the pituitary to do its secretions. Hypersecretion is an increased secretion of endocrine glands. So this would be like hyperthyroidism or hyperpituitarism. The four major glands of our endocrine system, and there are several glands that we'll go through, include the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, which are connected, as you saw in the nervous system. The thyroid gland and parathyroid glands, which are both within the neck and throat areas, and then the pancreas. So let's talk about the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is just below the brain. It's about the size of a grape, and it has two parts. There's an anterior pituitary lobe and a posterior pituitary lobe. There is an atrophy that could occur in the third region of our pituitary gland, and if this occurs during fetal development, or rather this does occur during fetal development, in other words, to make those cells kind of align appropriately at the dividing line between the anterior and posterior lobe. The pituitary gland secretes 9 hormones. The anterior pituitary secretes the majority of those. They include HGH, which is human growth hormone, TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, FSH, which is follicular stimulating hormone, LH, which is luteinizing hormone, PRL, which is prolactin, ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone, and MSH, which is melanocyte stimulating hormone, or melanin stimulating hormone. Either way, it's stimulating your melanocytes to secrete more melanin and darken the skin. The posterior pituitary secretes 2 hormones. The hormones are actually made in the hypothalamus, but the posterior pituitary excretes them. One is oxytocin and the other is ADH. This chart from your book goes through those hormones as where they are secreted from, their target tissue or target cells, and the action. So let's talk about some of these. Human growth hormone, or HGH, goes to almost every tissue in the body. It's going to skin, it's going to liver, it's going to muscles, it's going to bones, etc. It's not just about growing, as you'll look here at the action. It is actually controlling the growth of this individual cell. So this has to do with regulating mitosis. This also has to do with overall metabolism. The hypothalamus secretes growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone to control the secretion of human growth hormone. So in other words, the hypothalamus is going to tell the anterior pituitary, via releasing or inhibiting hormones, that it needs to either release human growth hormone or stop releasing growth hormone in the case of inhibiting hormone. So if your hypothalamus detects that the human growth hormone levels in your blood are low, the hypothalamus is going to secrete human growth hormone releasing hormone. That tells the anterior pituitary to release human growth hormone. Then that human growth hormone goes to all of the target cells and stimulates their metabolism for them to grow. There's also TRH, which is thyrotropin releasing hormone. That is going to signal to our anterior pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone is going to signal to our thyroid follicle cells that they need to secrete the thyroid hormones T3 and T4. T3 and T4 are essential in controlling basic cell reactions inside the cell. There's also GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, that's released from the hypothalamus. This hormone is going to tell our anterior pituitary to secrete follicular stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. FSH and LH will go to the target tissues of the ovaries and testes to either promote sperm and egg development or to control testosterone, estrogen, progesterone secretion, as well as ovulation in females. Prolactin releasing hormone or prolactin inhibiting hormone is going to be released by the hypothalamus, telling our anterior pituitary to secrete prolactin, which goes to the breast tissue cells or mammary cells and tells them to produce milk. CRH, or corticotropin releasing hormone, tells the adrenal glands that they need to, or rather tells the anterior pituitary to secrete adrenocorticotropic hormone, as well as MSH, the melanocyte stimulating hormone, which is then going to go to the respective target tissues of the adrenal cortex or the melanocytes. The adrenal cortex cells will then produce glucocorticoids such as cortisol, as the stress hormone, to allow for the breakdown of proteins and fats, or the melanocytes will then will increase production of melanin. Here it says have an unknown function in humans. Overall, it is going to boost pigmentation of the skin, but otherwise there's very little known about MSH. This animation here goes through the role of human growth hormone in growth and development. Let's talk about some disorders of the anterior pituitary. There's pituitary dwarfism, which is when human growth hormone is hyposecreted. So in other words, there's not enough human growth hormone and the individuals end up with a shorter stature. There's gigantism, which is hypersecretion of human growth hormone during childhood and puberty. This is going to cause very long limbs, very long bones. Then there's acromegaly, which is hypersecretion of HGH after puberty. That is going to cause slightly different types of features than the gigantism. Gigantism is going to mean your long bones are going to be much longer because of that HGH secretion during childhood and puberty. But after the growth plates has sealed, acromegaly is a much different condition in which the bones just become thicker and broader. So in this case, you can see this gentleman's face is very broad and very pronounced, and that's because of the acromegaly. The posterior pituitary gland secretes those two hormones that I mentioned, the oxytocin and the ADH, the antidiuretic hormone. Sorry, I had a brain block there. They're actually produced in the hypothalamus by these special neurosecretory cells. The posterior pituitary is actually a different type of tissue than the anterior pituitary. It's kind of an extension of the brain. If you look at it under the microscope, you'll see that it's actually made of neurons as opposed to endocrine cells. As I mentioned, oxytocin, the whole function of oxytocin is to stimulate the smooth muscle contraction of the uterus during labor. It provides a positive feedback mechanism, whereas most of our endocrine organs or endocrine hormones are regulated through negative feedback. Oxytocin is also going to stimulate the milk letdown reflex, the actual ejection of milk from the breast tissue, and that's triggered by that sucking mechanism that infants will do. ADH, antidiuretic hormone, acting on the kidneys as well as sweat glands, our arterioles, as well as parts of the brain to help our body conserve water and increase overall blood pressure. Here it says body pressure. It should be blood pressure there. And that's triggered by an increase in salt concentration or sodium concentration. Here you can see, speaking of drinking and maintaining fluid levels, I just had to take a sip there. ADH, as you can see, dehydration is caused by high blood osmolarity. In other words, when you have a lot of solutes in your blood but not a lot of liquid. So those osmoreceptors are going to sense that, and send nerve impulses to that posterior pituitary, releasing ADH from the posterior pituitary into the blood. ADH is going to act in a number of different tissues, the kidneys, to help the kidneys retain water, in other words, reduce the urine formation. It's going to reduce water loss through the sweat glands, constrict those sweat glands so they're not releasing water into the environment. It's going to constrict the arterioles to increase blood pressure. It's also going to stimulate the thirst centers in our brain to get us to be thirsty, so we will bring in more fluids to our body. Overall, all of those reactions are built in to help our body maintain normal blood pressure and normal blood osmolarity. Water retention is going to reduce blood osmolarity and inhibit those hypothalamic osmoreceptors, so it's going to have a reduced secretion or almost cessation of secretion of ADH once homeostasis is restored, or once your blood pressure is where it should be. This animation here goes through the effects of ADH. Diabetes insipidus is a condition where ADH is almost absent. So this is causing excessive thirst, frequent urination, large volumes of urine being produced. Basically, you will become dehydrated in this condition as your body's trying to bring in the liquid, but it is just leaving your body, and that's because you don't have enough ADH to retain the fluid in your body. Let's stop here for part 1.